So you would dismiss as as thoughtless any complaint against a society that had only one woman in the Senate, or only 11% blacks in Congress, or only 6% Jews, or whatever.
I wouldn't dismiss it. I would simply say, if there is evidence that you have, let us see that evidence. What I think is really tragic is that assertions have been made not only without evidence being offered, but without anyone even asking for evidence. It's as if these are self-evident truths that have been brought down from the mountainside.
So the thing to do is to look for non-invidious explanations.
No, the thing to do is look for whatever seems to be the most reasonable explanation in the circumstance. And I'm saying that the people who made the case the other way, or who've acted as if they made the case, typically have not felt the necessity even to bring evidence. They say there's one woman in the Senate, therefore. Or they say that women make X percent of the income of men without bothering to find out what percentage of those women are working part-time, what percentage of them are re-entering the labor force after 20 years of having children, etc. Rather than saying, let us compare now women who chose to stay in the labor force continuously since high school, on into their 30s, let's say, compared to men who did, and see how do they compare. And there, these great differences tend to disappear. In some cases, the women make more.
Well, but you seem substantially to have eliminated invidious explanations. For instance, when you write, how far have we come in removing discriminatory pay differences among individuals with the same qualifications and different racial or ethnic backgrounds? Among the younger generation, we have just about all the way. This is you.
Yes.
Now, this would suggest that you have satisfied yourself that there are no invidious standards that inhibit minority ethnics from...
No, you'll never reach the point where there are no invidious standards, because there will always...
They critically affect.
Oh, I'm saying that if you're trying to explain pay differences, that's not an explanation that will stand up to a closer look at the data. And that's true not only in the United States, incidentally, it's also true in other parts of the world, that if you look at, again, go back to the Chinese and Malaysia. In Malaysia, the Malays are the dominant force, not only numerically but politically. They control the government and so on.
In fact, they have anti-Chinese laws.
Oh, they do? Yeah. So there's no question whether the Chinese are discriminating against the Malaysia. I mean, all you have to do is read the books, the statute books, and they tell you there's no two ways about it. The fact of the matter is the Chinese make double the income of the average Malay. So the question is not whether people are discriminated against. The question is, how effective is that discrimination, and to what extent does it explain income differences? Because many of the groups that are above the average income in the United States and in other countries are groups that have demonstrably been discriminated against in various ways. The Jews would be classic. The Japanese also. And the Japanese make almost 1/3 higher income than the average American. So the question is not whether there's been this interracial friction and so on. That's existed everywhere and down through history. The question is, how much can you explain the income differences that way?
Well, assuming then that you can't explain them in terms of discrimination, then they have got to be explained in some other way. Now, what ways suggest themselves to you as subsidizing the principal residual differences?
Oh, I would think differences in skill and experience.
Or may I give the figures you give just as a background here for the audience? If the average American makes 100, Dr. Sowell points out that Jews make 170, Irish 103, West Indians 94, blacks 62, and Indians 60. Now, did you factor into that age differentials or not?
No, those were gross figures.
Those are gross figures.
Yes.
So therefore, they would come together a lot more if you took out the age.
In fact, I did one set of numbers some years ago of 30-year-old males only, and there the differentials began to shrink. As you look at other things like that, the more things you hold constant, the more these numbers tend to shrink. Unfortunately, after all this time, no one has bothered that I know of to try to eliminate differences of age, differences of education, and particularly qualitative differences in education, and try to see how much is left after you've done all of that. It begins to fall away pretty rapidly, though, with some of those things.
Okay, but nevertheless, certain significant differences remain.
Major differences, and I don't want to be optimistic, because if you're poor for reason X rather than for reason Y, that is no enormous consolation. I mean, that will not impress the landlord or the people at the supermarket. The fact is, they want to know how much money do you have. And you want to know how much money you're going to get, too. So that these are major differences, and things need to be done about them. Unfortunately, politics involves telling people what they want to hear. And what people want to hear is that a certain kind of villainy can explain almost all of it. Now, there's no such thing as a lack of villainy among human beings. Anytime you take any large group of people, you have an almost inexhaustible source of sins. And if you want to look into all those sins, you can go on forever looking into them. The question is whether those sins explain the numbers you're talking about.
All right, let's grant that they don't, and go on to say what is it that does account for them, because we've eliminated genetic inclinations, we've eliminated invidious social factors, so we're left with what? For instance, region, where you come from, right?
Region makes a big difference.
Yeah, okay.
People who come from the South tend to have lower incomes, whether they're black or white.
Okay, let's say then
history.
we're talking about people in the same region.
There would still be a difference. History would be one big one.
History, what do you mean by history?
All right.
The history of the race, or the history of the personal history of when they got here, or what?
The history of the group in the United States. That, for example, the Jews who came here with all sorts of urban skills. They were clothing industries.
Garment workers.
Yes, that sort of thing. The Germans came here with all sorts of skill in beer making, piano making, machinery kinds of things. Blacks, of course, emerging from slavery had enormous disadvantages, even as compared to people emerging from slavery in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because, for one thing, in the United States, blacks were not allowed to have any responsibility under slavery. That one of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Now, people tried to do that in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't as possible, say, in the West Indies, because there weren't enough whites, for example, in the West Indies to matter. So if blacks were going to be fed in the West Indies, they had to be fed by growing their own food.
Like Angola and like the Portuguese colonies compared to, say, South Africa.
Yes. And so, therefore, the blacks, say, in the West Indies had all sorts of experience growing their own food, selling the surplus in the market, and, in fact, being responsible for budgeting what they had. Blacks in the United States were deliberately kept from having that. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
Well, I was going to ask you that. You've anticipated me. To what extent do you find that then that the welfare state is trying to preserve an ethos which precisely, I understand you to say, we need to liberate ourselves from?
Yes, that politics really involves getting people to vote for you, and people vote for you when they think that they can depend on you, when they are dependent on you. To the extent that people become self-reliant and can feel they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, to that extent do you lose your hold on their votes.
That's kind of a harsh generality, isn't it? Because a lot of people who really are philanthropically minded are in favor of the kind of thing that is generally understood as charitable intercession, isn't it?
Yes, there are people who are professional politicians who simply look at the bottom line of where the votes go. There are other people who sincerely believe that if they will hand out things here and there, that this will in fact benefit people. Again, looking at
your point is it doesn't.
It doesn't. I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. I've seen many examples around the world of people who began in poverty and ended in affluence. Not one of them has followed any pattern at all like what is being advocated for blacks in the United States. Many groups have remained in poverty for a very long time trying to follow those patterns.
These sort of permanent indigent classes.
That's right. Within the blacks, there's a very diverse movement, though. On the one hand, you have blacks who are getting more education, who are going to college, and so on. Their incomes are rising, not only absolutely, but relative to that of whites of the same description. It's those blacks who have not had, say, 9 years of schooling, who have not had 6 years of experience in the job market. Their incomes are declining relative to the incomes of incomes of whites. If over the very same span of time, so it can't be a matter of the business cycle or something like that, is that those blacks who have the advantages relative to others have now still more advantages. But those who had the very difficult poverty to deal with, that is becoming more difficult. A higher percentage of all black income is going to the top 20% of blacks over time.